you everyone for joining me today. My name is Eric Gross, and I'm Program Associate with the Aspen Institute Citizenship and American Identity Program, focusing heavily on the Better Arguments Project. The Better Arguments Project is a national civic initiative spearheaded by our program at the Aspen Institute, as well as our partners at Facing History and ourselves at Allstate. The most basic premise of the Better Arguments Project is that the key to addressing division in this country isn't for people to argue less, it's to argue better. We often hear from people, why are you calling for arguments in a time like this? Why can't it be called something nicer like the Better Conversations Project? But we believe that argumentation has a unique role in democratic life, and that is important for us to destigmatize the concept. The path forward is not for us to politely ignore our differences or agree to disagree. It's for us to find healthier, more constructive, and more empathetic ways to disagree and exchange ideas. And in doing so, we believe that we will find new solutions together, forge relationships across differences, and embrace the unique role of disagreement in a free, democratic society. At the Better Arguments Project, we like to joke that America doesn't need fewer arguments, it just needs less stupid ones. So I think it's fitting that I'm joined today by one of the smartest arguers in the world, Bo Seo. Bo is a two-time world champion debater and former coach of the Australian debating team and the Harvard College Debating Union. He drew from that experience to write his new book, which he's here to discuss with us today. It's titled Good Arguments, How Debate Teaches Us to Listen and Be Heard, released just last week from Penguin Press. Drawing from the strategies, structure, and history of debate, Bo teaches readers the art of disagreeing well and shows how it can improve their relationships with friends, family, and colleagues. He then goes on to demonstrate how, if more people were equipped with these skills, our society, institutions, and democracy would be better off. But before we jump into our conversation with Bo, I want to note for the audience that we will save some time at the end for audience questions. If you have anything you'd like me to ask Bo, please just drop some thoughts in the Q&A chat box, which I can select from. So Bo, without further ado, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Eric. I'm so pleased to be here.
So I hope the book launch has been going well for you, and we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And it feels appropriate to start off with some context around your book. So can you start off by telling us about your personal story that drew you to debate, as well as the intellectual inspiration that ultimately caused you to write this book?
I can, and I want to thank you so much and the Better Arguments Project for having me, Eric, and it's a thrill reading a little bit about the stories of the people joining us today. I mean, when you're writing a book, you feel like it's all on you, and you're being in front of the computer is the side of the action. But the more you realize, the power really rests with the reader, doesn't it? And even in the way in which you run your program, it's in that network of ideas spreading out and into communities that the kind of changes that we're hoping to see, that's where it's going to happen. So I'm really grateful to everyone for joining us. I started debate because I moved in the third grade from South Korea to Australia without speaking English. And I quickly found that the hardest part of doing that, of crossing language lines, was adjusting to real life conversation. Because it's in real life conversation that people can, even mid-sentence, pivot and talk about something completely different, and you get spun out. And all of those difficulties tend to compound when it's a disagreement, because passions tend to run and people's faces stop matching the words that are coming out of their mouth. And Australians aren't the best pronouncers of words at the best of times, but in a disagreement, the vowels really tend to eat up the whole word, And I think I wouldn't have had this language then, but I think I also sensed what many immigrants do, what many people who feel on the margins feel, which is that their welcomeness to a new place is kind of conditional, and it's conditional on not rocking the boat too much or not speaking your mind too much. And the combination of these things resolved made me resolve to just be very agreeable, to decide that what was going to get me through this was by smiling and keeping my thoughts to myself. And the thing that changed that for me was in the 5th grade, I joined the debate team on the strength of a single promise from my elementary school teacher, which was that in debate, when one person speaks, no one else does. And for someone who was used to being spoken over and interrupted and spun out, that sounded like a kind of salvation. And it made me want to get on. And so I did that for most of my kind of relatively short life. And we ended up winning the big university debating championships in 2016. And if I had written this book then, which was the first time I was approached to write this book, it would have read like a kind of a sports memoir, or I would say that if I knew anything about sports. And it would have been like, nerdy Rudy kind of thing, or like a stationary Rocky. And, it would have been about climbing the ranks of this activity. But so that was in 2016 that we won. But months after that, this country went through one of the most divisive election cycles that it had in recent history up to that point. That was between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. The following year, I moved to Beijing and did a master's program that was meant to bridge China and the US, and the trade war began, and the great freeze that we're still living through set in. And the year after that, I covered as a political reporter an election back home in Australia that mirrored a lot of the toxicity and divisiveness that I'd seen as a student in the US. And at that time, it became very difficult to see disagreement as anything other than a source of division and pain and even existential danger. And it was in the search for some kind of a solution that I started thinking back to the activity that had pulled me out of the kind of the aversive instinct towards disagreement that I think many of us are feeling. And so hence this book.
Great, thank you. So you described some of the problems that we're seeing in our society, but to focus a little bit more positively, what are some of the key lessons that you learned in debate that you talk about in your book? And what do you think would be possible if more people were trained in these habits of mind?
Obviously the book is a collection in some ways of the different things that I learned in debate, but I'll highlight sort of 2 of them. I think the first is that the structure of our conversations matter, right? And so for me, it was that when one person speaks, no one else speaks, right? What else happens in debate? Debate is a turn-taking activity where I get to say something, you get to say something, but I know I get to say something in response, right? So there's no kind of urgency to interrupt and to disrupt your contribution. While you're speaking, I'm listening so that I'm able to speak, right? And, debates begin, in the world of debate, every disagreement begins with an act of agreement, which is what we're actually talking about. So that a discussion about the dirty laundry doesn't also become what we spoke about last month and what your mother or father-in-law did and the way you're looking at me and so on. So both in terms of the structure and in terms of the topic, there's an agreement before we launch into disagreement about what it is we're talking about. I think the second thing that I would just highlight is, especially at a time now where I think many people think the most important thing in a disagreement is just sincerity and earnest belief in their contributions, and those things are important. I think at that time, debate reminds us that there is a skill to argument too, right? There's a skill of putting together your case, and also a skill to responding, right? A separate skill to using language and gesture and speech to shore up your arguments. And in some ways, it decouples the idea that you might be right or wrong, but you can also be persuasive and not persuasive, right? So you can be in a situation where you're correct, but you weren't the more persuasive party on the day, right? And I don't think this is something we think about very much, but it used to be that whether it be a rhetorical education or more specifically an education in argument, that was once seen as a kind of a requirement of citizenship. And more broadly, it factored into a vision of what a life and an education fully lived was. I want to bring back some of those skill-based education as a reminder that good arguments are work. Mm-hmm. So I would sort of start with structure and then say a reminder that disagreeing takes skill, and it takes effort, and it takes work. And what does that mean? And what does that mean in sum? My hope is that we can be more deliberate in our disagreements, both in terms of the disagreements that we choose to engage in and what we do once we're inside them, so that we can say at the end of a disagreement, that was worth it. You know, it was a bit of a pain, or it might have even been draining, or it might have required some self-disclosure, some moments of discomfort, but you should be able to say at the end of it, I would do it again, right? Because that's how the conversation continues.
Thank you. So there are about a dozen themes that you laid out that I can comment on. I'm going to pick one about what you said about being deliberate in our disagreements and debates. So I had a question coming into this session that was really inspired by your chapter titled Quiet, How to Know When to Disagree. So first, can you walk us through the logic structure that you laid out in that chapter about how to identify when to speak up in debate? I think the acronym you use is RZA, which I'd love for you to share. And then second, how do you approach the question that I think many of us in this sort of field, broadly speaking, are facing of identifying what topics should and should not be up for debate?
Yeah, definitely. And it is so this chapter appears kind of in the middle of the book. And, when you're training as a debater, you get excited because at each turn you feel like you're developing new skills to be able to knock down an argument or to come up with a killer line or something like that. And then you realize both within the competition and certainly in your personal life that it's not in your best interest to argue about everything, right? To be the hammer that sees the nail everywhere. And I think one of the things that better debaters and anybody who hopes to hold on to a romantic partner or anything like that, they have to learn to be judicious about the kinds of disagreements they pick. And I deal with this at two levels in the book, as you say, Eric. The first is in our personal lives, I want people to pause a little bit before they launch into a disagreement out of defensiveness or pride or something like that, and check four things. And this is the RISA framework. The first is to ask whether there is a real disagreement, right? As opposed to an imagined slight or something like that. Whether the disagreement in front of you is important enough to justify an argument about it. Whether it's specific enough. And this is what we said right at the beginning about saying, there's a million things we could disagree about and maybe we can have a million conversations, but for now we're having this one. So we want it to be specific enough so that you're making progress. And you want to make sure the two sides are aligned in their objectives. So they need not have the same goals per se, but if one person is there just to hurt the other person's feelings or something like that, that's probably not a worthwhile thing. Mm-hmm. And so there's a kind of a practical day-to-day element of before you launch into a conflict, there being some occasion to pause and to deliberate on whether launching into disagreement is the right thing. And all of that is obviously given a kind of a political edge nowadays of thinking about which disagreement or which issues are appropriate for debate and which are not. And here, I'm a bit less prescriptive, but I do make some suggestions in the book. And I think the most important of them is there are, for me, some issues that should not be debated. And namely, that is, we should not debate the equal moral standing of persons. And the reason for that is it's antithetical to what debate is, right? So the reason why we give people equal time in which to speak and we do this turn-taking thing and don't allow other people to interrupt is because we say each participant in this conversation is worth hearing from, right? And so to debate something like whether a member of a particular race is inferior to another would, in addition to all of the problems with that, be antithetical to what debate is, in my view. Then there are additional considerations, like when you're putting on a public debate, right, in a forum like this one, of suggesting there are two sides to an issue, right? There's also asking the participants, when you know the weight of arguing a case is borne very differently based on who those people are. Those are other considerations to kind of keep in mind. And just the last thing I'd say on that, Eric, because it is a topical thing these days, is just because something is not an appropriate subject for debate does not necessarily mean we should not talk about it, right? Mm-hmm. There are other ways of talking about issues that are not debating them, right? It could be we're just hearing people out, or it could be we're negotiating about it, or it could be we're bargaining about it, or something like that. But trying to think about other modes of speech other than debate, that conversation goes a lot easier when I think we have the skills of debate and we understand its uses and limitations better.
Great. Yeah, so on that topic of different ways of talking about things, let me take a moment to sort of compare and contrast what we do with the Better Arguments Project with what you do. So, the Better Arguments Project is all about finding healthier ways to disagree and argue in order to bring people together to bridge divides. And there are important ways in which the lessons of debate inform our work. For example, debate sounds basic, but claims must be grounded in facts and cited. At Better Arguments, the sort of terminology we like to evoke is historical context, and we emphasize the importance of grounding our claims with history. But there are also some important divergences between what we do and what competitive debate does. Namely, that in competitive debate has winners and losers, while the first principle of a better argument is take winning off the table, that you should be engaging to learn rather than to win or defeat the other side. So how do you think about the difference between your work with good arguments, our work with better arguments, and the times and places where winning should and should not be the goal of arguing?
It's a really rich question, and I'm still sort of wrestling with it. So this is a book about debate, and that is one answer, but not the only answer to the question, how do we disagree better, right? And that in turn, disagreement, is one answer, but not the only answer to the question, what do we do about the fact that all of us are different, but that we have to find ways of getting along, right? Disagreeing about our differences is not the only answer to that question. We sometimes have to grin and bear, right? Sometimes we have to negotiate. Sometimes we have to do other things. but disagreement is an important part of dealing with our differences. Debate is, in my view, an important part of disagreeing, right? And probably, Eric, where I am with this at the moment is, I think there are many languages of disagreement, right? And debate is one. And debate has skills and tools that can help us disagree better. But maybe what I'm arguing for is that we should learn to be a bit more multilingual, right? And to speak many languages of disagreement so that we're able to have not only more conversation, but different kinds of conversation, right? And I obviously think debate has a very important part to play in that. And so I'm advocating for that. But I certainly welcome, is, you know, and many of the people on the call would be more expert in this than I am, but in terms of the other kinds of disagreement that we need in our community, other kinds of conversation we need, how we can borrow lessons across conversations, but also learn those different registers, seems to me really important. And then second, more narrowly, just on the question about winning and losing, right? I mean, debate is kind of very interesting in this respect, because it is ostensibly so much about winning and losing. But in fact, you're going to lose most of the time. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is the World Championships, for example, is 500 teams. And it becomes knockout at some point. So you're probably going to be in the 499. And I was in the 499 every time, except twice, right? And so one of the things about the world today, where there aren't, you know, very many proper debates, in my view, is each individual win or loss feels very high stakes. But in a world where you do have lots of debates ongoing, you learn to take the wins and the losses, right? And there is a certain kind of humility that comes with that. And so I don't want to pretend that the gamesmanship of debate, the sense in which it does derive some of its powers from contest and from spectacle, these things, I don't want to shy away from that. But I also don't want to suggest that's the only thing that we need in our public discourse.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love that concept of, or really question about how do you teach debate in conjunction with other methods of disagreeing. And for there's some educators on the call today, I would just really encourage you all to drop any thoughts you have in the chat. I don't have an answer to the question. And
that would be terrific.
Sorry.
Good. Eric, just one thing I was going to add with that is, you know, this is a point that kids, I think, instinctively understand, which is debate is a game that lasts for some time, right? And they know to behave one way in a debate. And then once it's over, when they're out for lunch or when they're getting on the bus back to their school or something like that, they kind of reflect on the debate with some distance, or they learn to say things like, oh, you had a good point there, which they might not in the actual game of debate itself. And so this thing about learning to end a debate, right, I think is quite key to its usefulness. And it's a skill that kids understand better than I think many of us do as adults, where, you know, if you watch cable TV, it's like a game that just never ends.
Yeah.
So it may be relearning that skill rather than learning something new.
Well, and you already said it, but the other skill they really have, and I just want to highlight this other point that you brought up. Since you mentioned it to me last week, I've been thinking about it constantly, that it really seems like we overestimate the benefits of winning an argument. And we also overestimate the costs of losing one.
Yeah.
And create these high stakes games in our head that, you know, result in the type of environment that we are currently seeing.
I like that a lot. Yeah, I like that a lot.
So another really big question that you pose in your book that I'd love to pick your brain on some more is that you ask this question: is the lack of quality debates in our society, whether it be on social media, in the news, or day-to-day interactions, a symptom of broader societal ills? For example, a dysfunctional educational system or economic inequality, et cetera, or really a root cause of the problems that we are perceiving in our society?
Yeah, it's a hard question. And I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
Right. And for me, the fact that it's a bit of both matters a lot, right? Because, as I was saying, in the wash up from the 2016 election here, and in a lot of the divisiveness that we've seen, in as much as there was a kind of some glimmers of hope, right? They were usually in very structural solutions, right? The structure of voting, right? How does Congress work and conduct its business and so on. All of them are really important. And but where I'm hoping to make an intervention is a lack of capacity to disagree well with one another can become causal and can reinforce polarization because it makes us less willing and less able to successfully speak across differences, right? And so there's a kind of a loss of skills there that confirms our view that disagreements aren't going to go well. And that belief that disagreements aren't going to go well, in turn, often makes the disagreements worse, right? Because when we go into a disagreement bracing ourselves to get hurt, we're usually pretty defensive. We tend to actually look past the person we're talking to and speak to like an invisible audience of people who agree with you. And so you kind of go for cheap lines or especially on social media, slogans that people recognize as kind of like a flag, right? You're on this side as opposed to something else. And so the atrophying of the skills of disagreement tends to reinforce our lack of confidence, and our lack of confidence makes disagreements worse. And so where I'm hoping to make an intervention, and it's not so much that it's the most important intervention, it's just what I feel equipped to do, is to call for a rejuvenation of that skill set, and also through that, a kind of a confidence and a faith to some extent that disagreements can be a force for good, in addition to all those dangers that we've spoken about.
Yeah. Another problem with sort of the lack of faith, so to speak, that disagreements are going to be productive, that you highlight in your book, is that the problem with our current arguments isn't just that they're toxic and counterproductive for those involved, but that the environment causes people to retreat from public discourse together. They think it's just not worth it to get involved in the hot button topics, debates of the time. And you have this really moving quote in your conclusion that I really wanted to share with people. And I would like to let you know that I'm borrowing this when I lead workshops and things like that.
Oh, great.
I think it really captures what we're all about. And I'm going to share verbatim. You said, observing the divisive, enraged arguments in the public square, as well as the fetid pylons on social media, I worried less for the hurt feelings of the participants than for the greater polarity who might be dissuaded from participating at all. For I had known all my life that moment when one decided an argument was simply not worth it, and that the best one could do was keep quiet. So I wanted to ask you, why is it so important to you that we find ways to call these sideline voices in, both from your own personal lens as well as from a broader societal focus?
Yeah. It does start, the stakes of that feel really personal to me in some ways, because I think I knew from those early years in Australia when I decided not to disagree anymore, that silence is not peace. It's not internal peace, and it's not peace with your surroundings either, right? And what can start as just distance that you feel from your peers and from the world around you can also shade into the darker stuff of, contempt and indifference. And those seem to me as big a threat to a social fabric, and in particular to a democracy, as anything else. So, I think it has to do with, when I'm at a party, it's usually the people on the sidelines who have the most interesting things to say, because maybe one is they're saving it up, but the other is they're also listening, aren't they? Rather than being so preoccupied with their own story and ideas. So for me, it's to the loss of all of us to not hear from those voices, right, who feel dissuaded from participating. And in addition to that loss, you have what happens to the conversation in the absence of such usually moderating, nuanced, interesting perspectives, which is like-minded people egging each other on further and further in their own silos. And when they come together, it being the loudest, most strident kind of voices dominating the public discussion. So both for the perspectives that we would lose, right, in the absence of a more inclusive conversation, but also what that absence means for the quality of the conversation that remains, right, and that goes on, right? It's not as though the conversation stops, right? So for both of those reasons, it feels important to call people in and to create the kinds of conversations that includes all of those voices.
Yeah. And to focus on what you mentioned about how maybe that person who's quieter is actually listening. This might seem like a really basic point, but I just thought there was a lot of wisdom in your book title, specifically the conjunction that debate teaches us to listen and be heard.
Yeah.
Implying a relationship between listening and being heard. Maybe I'm overthinking this, but I've been, both in my personal life and relationships with friends, family, etc., and in my professional life in which I teach people how to have better arguments, I've sort of been grappling with the question: why is it that you need to listen to others in order to be heard yourself? And what is that relationship between between listening and being heard?
Yeah, it's an intimate relationship. When you're debating, you can often have a very clear picture of where you want the other person to end up, right? Which is, you want them to be persuaded to pass this legislation, or to buy this model of car rather than something else, to hire this person rather than someone else. But we know the journey, just the way it has a destination, must have a beginning place. And in order to move one person from point A to point B, you have to have a sense of where it is that they're coming from, right? And I think one thing debate gets right in terms of that turn-taking structure I talked about is there's always a kind of a call and response, right? And I feel like this is a lesson I'm having to learn every day, because as I said right at the top, this is my first book. I'm hoping to do a good job talking about it and so on. In the same way that, as a debater, you want to make the best arguments and so on. But I think you realize over time that whatever hope you have of making progress and also learning things about a subject that even you think you understand pretty well, comes in the exchange, right? And comes in the dialogue. And so for me, the importance of listening to disagreement is just a recognition of what I think is a truth about the world, which is none of us are self-sufficient, right? None of us know everything, and it's not our thoughts and insights alone that's going to get us closer to truth, that's going to get us closer to the best solution, all of the things that we're hoping to get out of a disagreement.
Well, and that brings us to another, really basic aspect of debate that we actually haven't talked that much about, which is just a simple fact that debate forces you to consider the merits of opposing arguments and opposing viewpoints, which I'm really not so sure that many of us are forced to do in day-to-day lives. Maybe in school, kind of, but like not necessarily in everyday interactions. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and it's everywhere in debate, right? So the basic structure of debate is you're usually given a topic, and regardless of what you believe about it, you're assigned to argue for or to argue against. And over the course of a kind of a long career, you end up being on both sides of most issues, right? And even within an individual debate, because it's in your best interest to understand the opposing party's perspective, you usually brainstorm, for example, the best arguments for the other side, or you look over your speech as though you were looking at it through the eyes of an opposition. And all of that sounds a little mercenary, and one of the critiques that get made of debaters is they can argue both sides of everything. So certainly the ability to argue well is no substitute for the good judgment that it takes to argue for the right and just side. But at a time when so many of our conversations feel stuck, both in the political realm, but also, with our family members and in the workplace and so on, that idea of forcing yourself to kind of experience the subjective reasonableness of other beliefs, right? The ways in which it feels right to the other person, the ways in which they get to a conclusion through a series of steps, right? That approximating that experience, I say in the book, seems to kind of reflect a certain view of empathy, not as a mysterious psychic connection that just happens, or in the church where I grew up, it was like a virtue. You either kind of had it or you didn't. And you might start to view it as a series of actions, right? And something that emerges, and arguments and thought exercises and this quite intellectual view of things is not the only thing that we need to bridge across differences, but I think it could help.
Yeah. So speaking very broadly about our current context with arguing and debate, what sort of trends make you the most concerned about our societal ability to argue effectively? But then also, I would love it if you could also give us something optimistic as well about what opportunities or reasons for optimism do you see out there?
Yeah. Something sweet to make the medicine go down. I think two things give me concern. And now that I'm thinking about it, they're two pretty big things. So one is, I think the channels of disagreement, and in particular, social media, where the dynamic we were talking about of being indifferent to the person across from you and performing for an audience feels very salient. The promotion of the most divisive content, the most inflammatory content, so that the acoustics of the space is not neutral at all. That feels like a problem. And I suppose part of the mission of this book is to return disagreements to face-to-face interactions, right? Whether that be one-on-one often, or in community organizations and civil society, right, of the sort that I know you do a lot of work with.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that gives me concern is the loss of a shared commitment to the truth, right, and the many sources of misinformation, and I still have some confidence that the great advantage of truth over lies is things tend to add up, you know, and even when we tell lies, we tend to trip up among ourselves, right? Because it's not true. But we're starting to see misinformation and mistruths become formative of a worldview in a way that that kind of contact with the truth, right, that can illuminate the ways in which the lie is a lie, it's problematic, it doesn't fit with what we know to be true about the world, that kind of contact no longer happens. So both of those two problems I see in some ways as a symptom of a kind of an ethic that says like for like, you know, we sort of birds of a feather, right? We gather with people who already agree with us, who share our views, and both social media and a lot of the siloed ecosystems that result in the proliferation of mistruths seem to me a product of that ethic. Now, the thing that gives me some measure of hope is kind of what we were saying about the people who have been sidelined from the discussion. Is this kind of divisive, toxic public conversation, which bleeds into our families, bleeds into our workplaces, actually serves very few people, right? And some people profit off it, right? And some people make careers out of it. Mm-hmm. But for almost anyone else, it's the source of divisiveness and pain. And I do think that there is already, and there will be, a kind of an urge to find an alternative way of disagreeing, an alternative way of dealing with one another. And I think to that conversation, debate has some contribution to make, and through even our conversations, Eric, and sometimes the differences between us, as you said, I think doing a lot of that working out of thinking about what kind of conversations we want to have, that will be helpful, because I think people will want those answers and will want those alternatives.
Thank you, Bo, for sharing that optimism. And I guess I just want to echo that a little bit with one little piece of optimism that I have. And this is super anecdotal, but I started working on the Better Arguments Project in fall 2020. And just in my personal life, you know, when you meet someone, they ask what you do for work, you start having a conversation what you do. I do feel as if what I'm working on now resonates with people more just 2 years later than it did when I first started. I think when I first started working on these issues, I think people, you know, didn't quite get it. It didn't quite make sense to them. They were like, why is that important? But now I do feel like when I talk about the issues that we work on with the Better Arguments Project, that people immediately get it. And they think that's important. And, you know, maybe you could view that pessimistically as, oh, the problem has just gotten so bad. But I do think that people recognizing the issue and wanting to find ways to work on it is a productive first step. Yeah. Okay, I just have one last question before I get to audience questions. I promise I'm going to get to them. If you're watching and you have a question to ask, please drop it in the Q&A box, which is technically separate from the chat box. I know it's confusing like that, and I'm going to get to some of those. So, Bo, my last question for you. In your conclusion, you spent some time being very introspective thinking about what your goal here was, whether it was to, well, I'm going to paraphrase and hopefully paraphrase satisfactorily, that you're struggling with the question, am I trying to scale debate, or am I sort of trying to speak to people who want to improve their skills, who want to read this book? Where did you land on whether or not to scale the concepts that you outline in this book?
Yeah, so and I had a friend of mine, who's an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, and he treated the book as like a pitch for a business, and he quoted all these venture capitalists say, "How does this scale? How does this scale? How does this scale?" And where I settled was it doesn't scale, right? And it doesn't have that kind of leverage where one action has a multiplier effect that affects millions. Instead, what change I can hope to make with this book is, and what change debate can hope to make in the world, is to change the minds of individual debaters. And of the many changes that it can kind of be responsible for, I think the most important is to persuade people to keep talking. And in those one-on-one interactions, community-to-community discussions, it's not even that I believe that's where we take back the power. I think that's where a lot of the power resides. And so I haven't attracted any venture capital funding for this book, but I think that's.
I'm sorry to hear that.
No, that's all right.
You have a webinar with the Aspen Institute, which would be better.
True.
Great. So now I have the pleasure of sharing some audience questions, which were really great. So Mary asked, I would be interested in hearing Bo's reflections on the US presidential debates. To me, they don't seem to be real debates. If he agrees with this observation, what do we have to do to bring debate back into the political stage? What's missing in the way we conduct debates and town halls to result in more open, honest, and responsive discussion?
I do agree with the observation, and in some ways, those debates were really threatening to my view of what debate was, and even the argument that I'm putting forward, because I don't think you could say the debates were a force for good in many of those encounters in the presidential cycle. I think and I do diagnose this and analyze it a little bit in the book, but I think where I landed was those debates were in some ways hijacked into becoming something other than debates. They really felt like brawls. And a brawl has very different rules than a debate, right? Whereas the point of a debate is to discuss a single question using reasoned arguments that are backed up with, that are justified, illustrated with examples. A brawl is really about the show of dominance, isn't it? So there's at least three levels on which we should kind of think about how we do better, right? One is, as a participant in those kinds of debates with bullies, and it's not just on the presidential level, we see it, we have bullies in the workplace, and we have them in our homes sometimes, right? Because we all have the capacity to be defensive, to be bullying. There are some skills of responding to those tactics, pausing and reminding people that this is a debate we're having and not some other kind of discussion. So there's a kind of a thing that individuals can do. There's things that we have to think about from an institutional perspective of returning some of those rules to make sure the architecture, right, of the conversation is something that's conducive to debate, whether it be not allowing people to interrupt. So I thought things went much better, for example, in the debates where they turned off the microphone and they just said, you're not allowed to talk when you're not talking. Yeah. And then finally, to bring it back to us, I think a community of people and a society of people that knows to discern good arguments from bad and possesses a lot of the skills of good debate and good disagreement is one that I hope will be more immune to the kinds of manipulations of opportunists and demagogues and people who would exploit debate for bad. So I think there are levels to that conversation, but I share the view that those debates seem kind of an important data point for us to think about as we consider what we want debate to do for us.
Thank you. We're going to do rapid fire with a few questions. Right. One of which I can answer myself. Will recording be available for sharing with others? Yes, I'm going to put this on YouTube after this. Right. But we'll want to give a shout out to that one. So Evan asked, what people have you taken a lot of inspiration from in terms of improving your debating and writing this book on making good arguments? So I guess, do you have any good arguments heroes?
Yeah, I mean, there's many, and I profile some of them in the book. Even someone like Malcolm X, right, and his debates with James Farmer, who was a civil rights leader, and being able to be on this kind of on the same team in a broad level, but to be able to frankly disagree about your differences and to do it in as eloquent and as detailed a way as they have, that felt very important. More recently, I was a political reporter, and I admired many colleagues and mentors in the field who played that role of kind of adversary, right? And it wasn't that they necessarily believed in all instances the questions they were asking, but there was a kind of a willingness to embody roles for a while and to take a leap that kind of direct and frank exchange and disagreement could help unearth truth. So those are some people I'd nominate.
Thank you. And I'm going to combine a few questions. We got a bunch from educators who are interested in teaching these type of skill sets to kids. So I guess like the highest level, what parts of your book would you want to teach to high school students? And what do you think would be like the most impactful thing that, let's say high school educators could do to help kids with debate skills?
I think the first is to organize debates, right? And they're not hard to do. And they take paper and pen and an arrangement of tables, probably one on one side, one on the other. And whether it be kind of historical issues, whether it be a debate about texts in the English classroom, there are lots of efforts underway. I think Bob Littan is on the call, and I know he's involved with an organization that tries to bring it into classrooms. So there's a organizing of debates, but then there's all the different skills of how to construct an argument, what rebuttal is, what the tools of rhetoric are. And I think those can be integrated quite easily, even short of organizing an actual debate, into the ways in which we teach and learn.
Thank you. You knocked out like 10 different questions with one answer.
Okay, good.
Henry asked, if the purpose of debate is to find truth, to create, quote unquote, a marketplace of ideas, how does it create the conditions in which truth can be perceived and acknowledged?
That's a really wonderful question. And I think there's two things I would say. The first is debate doesn't take place in a vacuum, right? And so the values that we have in a community, and one of them should be respect for truth, helps form the background conditions of good debate. Having said that, there's also a kind of a feedback mechanism where the kinds of debates that we have help form those social views. And the thing that I would say that to that within debate is, and maybe the most important reminder here is, as I said earlier in the conversation, you can be right and unpersuasive. Another way to say that is you can possess the truth and fail to convince people of it, right? And so I think sometimes, and I had this experience as a competitor all the time, where when you feel like you're in possession of a great truth, you can often become lazier in your argumentation and less patient with the other side. Like, how are you not getting this? And so I think in that moment, recognizing truth may not prevail on its own, both in terms of the individual skills it requires to persuade people, but also in setting the societal conditions where truth is respected. I think those are two important reminders.
I love that thought. Truth might not prevail on its own. Steve asks, so we already sort of touched on the problems of social media. He's asking if you have any ideas for reforms that you would make to social media to reinforce listening or making debates less of a brawl in your own language.
Yeah, and frankly, Steve, I sort of switch into reporting mode for this part of the book, and there are some interesting studies, often done around Reddit, of disagreements that tend to go better online and worse, and there are some kind of tips that you might be able to internalize in navigating those a little bit better. And it's Reddit as opposed to the other platforms because those communities tend to have sort of stronger norms, right? And so there are kind of subcultures there that are committed to arguing well. I am personally a bit less optimistic on what those platforms can do for us. And for me, you can imagine social media platforms that are better than what we have now, that don't promote divisive content, that are stricter about getting rid of anonymous people and bots off their sites and so on. But I'm less optimistic that incremental changes or changes in our behavior and tactics is the right thing, and that probably the action that we can have, which will have the most impact, is to disagree and to take things offline and to disagree in person.
Thank you, Bo. So my colleague Seth just dropped a link to your book in the chat. Good Arguments, How Debate Teaches Us to Listen and Be Heard, available now if anyone's interested in buying the book. This is the last Better Arguments webinar of the summer. We're going to take July and August off and then be back with our usual programming in the fall. Please let me know if you liked sort of this guest speaker model. Maybe we'll investigate doing some more sessions like this. But before I close this out, I just want to give you an opportunity to share any closing or parting thoughts that you might have.
Well, mostly to say thank you so much to you, Eric, and to Eric Liu also, who's been a kind of a mentor through this process. And as I say, I hope this will be the beginning of a conversation, rather than this be the conversation in its entirety. For me, the most exciting part about writing this book and now talking about it is, I think there are some perspectives that I have and some insights I've gained into debate, but I'm most excited to see those ideas change through contact with other people's expertise and through that process of adaptation and translation by which it becomes hopefully a feature of the world outside of my computer. So thanks so much for joining, and please feel free to reach out if there are ways in which I can be helpful, and I really hope to keep the conversation going. So thanks very much.
For sure. It will definitely just the start of the conversation, not the end. Thank you so much, Bo. Thank you everyone for being here, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye.